A young, handsome, muscular rancher noticed bruises on his cook and her daughter. The town never forgot what he did next. The first green of spring was trembling through the meadows when Elijah Mitchell pushed open the kitchen door of his ranch house. The hinges gave their low groan, and the scent of warm bread drifted toward him, as though the season itself had found its way into Lila Mae Carter's oven. Sunlight spilled across the worn wooden table, catching in dust motes that turned the air golden, and he paused for a moment on the threshold, hat in hand, before stepping inside. Lila stood at the stove, shoulders bent, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She moved with quiet rhythm, stirring the heavy pot, lifting biscuits onto a plate, brushing her hair back with the back of her wrist. She had the kind of stillness that looked like peace from afar but, when watched long enough, revealed itself as something else entirely, exhaustion hidden behind steady hands. Elijah knew that sort of stillness. He had seen it in horses broken too young, in his own reflection after his father's passing. It was then that he saw it, the bruise. Dark against pale skin, running along the thin bone of her wrist. She pulled her sleeve down quick, as though she'd felt his gaze like a brand. He said nothing. Elijah Mitchell was a man who knew silence better than speech. He had carried lumber across streams alone, mended fences with no one to hand him nails, buried kin with his own hands. Words had never come easy. Yet the sight of that bruise settled in him like a stone at the bottom of a well. The back door creaked again, and the soft laugh of a child carried in. Juniper, June as everyone called her, burst through with wildflowers clutched in her little fist, her cheeks bright from the morning chill. She was 8, with hair the color of ripened wheat and eyes too solemn for a girl her age. Elijah caught the echo of another bruise on her forearm when the flowers slipped and scattered. She knelt quickly, scooping them back together, but not fast enough to hide from him. He looked away, jaw tight. Outside, the meadow rolled green and new, as though the world were beginning again. But here inside, something older, darker pressed at the edges of the light. Lila's voice floated over her shoulder, calm as ever. "Biscuits will be ready in a moment, Mr. Mitchell." He wanted to tell her not to call him that she was more than hired help, more than the whispers the town clung to. But his tongue stayed heavy. He sat down instead, hat turning slow in his rough hands. The room carried a hush, broken only by the scrape of metal against pot, the soft hum of Lila's tune, a hymn, perhaps, though she sang so low it sounded like she was humming for her daughter alone. June climbed onto a chair beside him, placing her wildflowers in an old mason jar that leaned on the table. She glanced up at him, eyes wide, expectant, as though waiting for him to notice, to praise. Elijah reached, steady hand lifting the jar upright, and gave her a nod. It was enough to light her whole face. But it wasn't enough for him. That bruise lingered in his mind like a shadow stretched long over pasture. By noon, the ranch bustled with its usual rhythm. Horses watered, fences checked, calves stumbling after their mothers. But Elijah's thoughts stayed tethered to what he'd seen. Every creak of a board or call of a crow seemed to echo with it. When he found himself at the far field, reins loose in his hand, he closed his eyes against the wind and remembered his own mother's wrists, how his father's anger had left them purple. Memory came like a knife, her silence, her bowed head, the way no one had stepped between them. He had been too young, too small, too powerless. Now he was none of those things. That evening, when supper came, the bruise was hidden again. Lila wore longer sleeves, the fabric brushing her knuckles. Her daughter leaned against her, drowsy, whispering questions only a child would think to ask. Why the frogs sang louder after rain, why the stars moved slow across the sky. Lila answered patiently, her voice soft, though Elijah caught the tremor beneath it. He should have spoken then. Should have asked. Should have demanded. But instead he watched her ladle stew into his bowl, her hands careful, her eyes never lifting to his. He wanted to reach across the table and set his hand atop hers, steadying, promising, but the gulf between them was filled with silence too wide to cross with one motion. Later, as the fire sank low, Elijah sat on the porch, pipe unlit in his hands. The moon rose pale over the land, and spring peepers called from the creek. Lila's shadow moved against the curtain inside, rocking her daughter to sleep. He thought of the town then, of how they whispered about her when she came to buy flour, how they remembered her leaving Harlan Michael, How no one spoke of what had happened in that house, but everyone knew. They called her ruined. They called her proud. They called her a woman who had chosen wrong. None of them spoke of the courage it took to leave, of the strength it took to keep walking with a child in tow. Elijah clenched his jaw, the pipe creaking in his grip. The bruise would not leave him. Morning came with pale light, with meadowlarks trilling on the fence posts. Lila moved through the kitchen, apron tied neat, sleeves rolled again. Elijah entered, mud still on his boots from the barn. He paused when he saw her, because the bruise had darkened overnight, climbing up her arm like a cruel vine. Her eyes flicked to his, quick as a deer startled in the woods, then dropped again. She turned back to the stove, pretending she hadn't seen the weight in his gaze. He sat, slower this time. The silence pressed close. June danced in, bright, her laughter bouncing against walls that seemed too thin to hold it. She climbed onto her chair and began braiding strands of grass she'd gathered. Elijah watched the girl's small fingers fumble, watched the way Lila's shoulders curled ever so slightly, watched the bruise. Every detail carried weight. Every moment whispered what no words were speaking. He thought of how his father's silence had meant consent. How every man in town who looked away had left his mother to bear what she bore alone. The spoon clattered from Lila's hand, rattling against the pot. She caught it quick, murmuring, apologizing, though there was no need. June's eyes darted between them, as though measuring safety by the lines of his face. Elijah steadied his breath, forced calm into his shoulders, forced gentleness into his gaze. Still he said nothing. By dusk, he carried buckets from the well, the sky washed pink and gold. Lila stood in the doorway, apron dusted with flour, hair loose from its pins. June clutched her skirt, pointing at a bird wheeling above the corral. For a heartbeat, the scene looked like something whole, something belonging. But the bruise betrayed it all. Elijah knew then that the silence could not last. That sooner or later, a man would have to choose whether to stand or to turn away. And as he set the bucket down, as the sun slipped behind the cottonwoods, his eyes caught on the edge of the pasture. A figure lingered in the distance, leaning against the split rail fence. Broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. Watching. Waiting. The sight froze him. Harlan Michael. The name slipped across his memory like rust across steel, carrying with it every whisper, every dark knowing the town refused to say aloud. Elijah's hand tightened around the bucket handle until his knuckles shone white. The bruise on Lila's wrist was no longer a secret between them. It was a warning. And the man who had carved it stood just beyond the fence, shadow stretching long in the last light of day. The thaw came fully into town that week. Mud squelched under wagon wheels, and blossoms leaned white against apple branches in the churchyard. Children ran barefoot through puddles, their laughter carrying like the sound of bells. Yet for all the signs of newness, whispers crept through Main Street like a wind that never warmed. They spoke of Bruises, of a woman who ought to have stayed quiet, of a rancher who ought to have kept his distance. Elijah Mitchell rode in with a load of timber stacked high. His coat was unbuttoned against the soft warmth of spring, sleeves rolled, forearms cut with the sun's hard work. He swung down from the saddle in front of Whitlow's mercantile, and though his boots struck the mud, the sound that followed was softer, the shuffle of skirts, the turn of heads, the tightening of voices. They spoke low, but he heard. He always heard. That's her, the one he keeps on as cook. Bruises or no, a woman leaves her husband, folks don't forget. And Mitchell, too young to understand what kind of shame he's courting. The words pressed against his shoulders like weight. Elijah ignored them, carrying his timber to the porch. But his eyes caught Lila Mae Carter stepping from the mercantile door, flour sack hugged to her chest, June clutching her skirt. She kept her chin tucked, but her ears reddened at the whispers she could not help but hear. June's small face tilted upward, questioning. Elijah caught it, the way children look for answers adults cannot give. He saw how Lila squeezed her daughter's hand tight, as though she could shield her from words sharper than any whip. The blacksmith, Jonas Vale, leaned at his forge across the street, hammer still in his hand. He gave Elijah the barest nod, half warning, half solidarity. His gaze flicked to Lila, then to Michael's kin gathered outside the saloon. Broad men, arms crossed, grins like wolves. They did not need to speak. Their silence was promise enough. Elijah loaded his wagon slow, deliberate, letting his presence stand between the woman and the eyes that clawed her. When June stumbled in the mud, he reached steady hands, lifting her to her feet. The child laughed despite herself, holding onto his thumb like it was the only anchor she had. And though Lila's lips parted, as if to protest, she said nothing. Only her eyes flickered, wide with something caught between gratitude and fear. The mercantile bell jingled as Mary Whitlow herself stepped out, apron still dusted white. She set her hands on her hips and glared at the murmuring crowd. "Ain't a soul here that don't live in glass houses," she said, voice like iron wrapped in linen. "You'd best mind your own pains before casting stones." But gossip is a weed that grows faster for being cut. By evening, the talk had spread into every corner of town, across checkerboards in the saloon, whispered over hymnals at church benches, murmured at the smithy's anvil. They said Elijah Mitchell was letting shame into his house. They said Lila Carter was a woman who'd never learn her place. They said June's bruises were proof of curses that ran in bloodlines. Elijah heard some of it, but most he felt in the air, in the way doors closed quick when he rode past, in the way eyes turned away when he sought them. That night, Lila stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled, washing plates in silence. Her hands moved slow, deliberate, and Elijah could see the tremor running through her wrists. June sat at the table, chin in her palms, eyes heavy from the day. The lamp cast soft glow, shadows stretching long against the plank walls. Finally, Lila spoke. Her voice cracked like ice breaking on a thawed creek. "He comes around still. At night. He waits beyond the fence." Elijah set his jaw. He had known it, but hearing it pulled the truth into bone. She kept her gaze on the water, knuckles white against the dish. "I thought leaving would free us. But he's got kin everywhere. I can't keep June safe if he decides." Her voice faltered, breaking into silence. Elijah moved, slow as ever, placing firewood by the stove. He said nothing, but his hands shook once, betraying what his tongue could not. June lifted her head. "Mama, Mr. Mitchell fixed the pony's bridle today." Her voice was soft, hopeful, a child's attempt to stitch light into a room heavy with shadow. Lila managed a faint smile, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. Elijah stood at the doorframe, watching. He felt the ache of memory, the nights his own mother had bent over him, hiding her bruises with scarves, whispering lullabies no one else heard. He had sworn as a boy that he would never be that kind of man. But now the choice before him was heavier, whether to be the man who stayed silent. Over the following days, he began to act, not with words, but with the only language he trusted. He left extra firewood stacked against the wall. He mended the stove door so it would no longer rattle in the wind. He repaired the latch on the window of June's room, so no shadow could slip inside. The town noticed. They always noticed. "He's courting her, sure as sunrise. Shame'll bring shame. Mitchell's setting himself up for ruin. A man who chooses a woman like that, it'll end in blood." The saloon door swung often with Michael's kin stepping in and out, their eyes sharp as knives when they spotted Elijah. Still he walked Main Street with steady gait, hat tipped low, June's small hand sometimes resting in his. The child's laughter, high and pure, seemed to cut through the mud of rumor, even if only for a heartbeat. Jonas Vale caught him once outside the forge, voice pitched low. "You know what you're stepping into, Mitchell. Michael don't forgive. And he don't fight alone." Elijah met his gaze, silent. Then he nodded, as though nodding to himself. That evening, as dusk painted the horizon lavender, Elijah saddled his horse and rode the fence-a-line. The air was thick with frog song, the smell of damp earth rising. And there, near the cottonwoods, he saw it again, a figure lingering, hat low, smoke curling from a pipe. Watching. Always watching. Lila was on the porch when Elijah returned, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders though the night was not cold. She looked at him as if searching for something, answers, perhaps, or shelter. He could not give her answers. But he stepped up beside her, standing still, letting the silence speak what words failed to hold. She glanced down at his hand resting on the porch rail. Hesitated. Then, with a trembling breath, she set her own beside it. Not touching, not yet. Just near enough that the air between seemed to hum. Inside, June called for her mother. The spell broke. Lila withdrew, but the moment lingered, tucked away like a pressed flower between pages. The whispers continued, thicker than spring pollen. Yet something had shifted. In the hush of the kitchen, in the quiet acts of kindness, in the gaze Elijah held when Lila dared to look up, a seed of trust had been planted. Small, fragile, but alive. And as the days stretched on, as apple blossoms fell like pale snow upon the churchyard, the whispers took on a harder edge. For Harlan Michael himself had returned to the saloon, his voice loud, his promises darker. He boasted of reclaiming what was his. He spoke of teaching Mitchell a lesson. He laughed, the sound echoing down the street like a challenge no man could ignore. Elijah heard it. Everyone did. The town held its breath. And Lila, standing at the mercantile with her daughter's hand in hers, lifted her eyes and saw Elijah across the street. For the first time, she let her hand rest against his arm as he approached. Just a touch, brief and trembling, but enough to set the whole street whispering louder than ever. The bruises on her wrist had faded some, but in their place a new mark grew, hope, faint and tender as spring grass pushing through the thaw. Yet in the saloon window, Harlan Michael watched, his eyes like coals, his grin cold as steel. The town's whispers were no longer rumor. They were prophecy. The moon rose pale as bone over the Mitchell ranch, spilling silver over the corrals and painting the cottonwoods in trembling light. A restless wind carried the scent of damp earth, and Elijah Mitchell stood in the shadow of the barn, listening. The horses stirred as though they too sensed the unease. Somewhere in the night, a hinge creaked soft. He tightened his grip on the lantern. It was not the barn door he feared. It was the silence that followed, the hush that stretched too long. He moved quietly, boots sinking into soft ground, and caught the shape at the edge of the yard. A figure shifting in the dark, broad shoulders leaning toward the light from the house window. Lila May was inside, kneeling at her daughter's bedside. Her lips moved in a prayer, soft and tremulous, while June clutched her hand, fighting sleep. The warm glow of the lamp behind them turned the kitchen curtains into silhouettes. Elijah's chest tightened. For that quiet, for that fragile picture, he would break the world. The figure stepped closer, and Elijah moved before thought could catch him. His stride was measured, heavy, each footfall meant to be heard. The man turned, Harlan Michael, face drawn in liquor's haze, eyes red as coals. "Elijah Mitchell," Michael slurred, hat cocked low. His grin showed teeth like broken glass. "Ranch boy playing at house with another man's leavings. You reckon the town's laughing behind your back?" Elijah didn't answer. His silence was steady, a wall Michael's words could not breach. Michael stepped closer, breath sour, fists clenching and unclenching. "She's mine. Always was. Always will be. You think you can stand there and keep me from what's mine?" Elijah's voice came low, measured, heavy as a tolling bell. "You will not touch what is under my roof." The words rang out in the night, more vow than warning. Lila's shadow flickered on the curtain as she shifted, perhaps hearing the voices outside. Elijah did not look back. He kept his eyes on Michael, on the way the man's hands twitched, on the danger curling like a snake at his boots. Michael laughed, ugly and loud, a sound that ripped across the meadow. "You think you're a man, 'cause you've got broad shoulders? A man takes what's his, Mitchell. A man don't hide behind silence and bruised women." Elijah's jaw tightened. For a moment, words rose like fire in his throat, memories of his own mother's bruises, of nights spent listening to her sob quiet in the dark. But he swallowed them down, let them burn in his chest instead. He stepped forward. One step, then another. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. The ground seemed to carry his weight, the silence louder than Michael's laughter. At last, Michael faltered, taking half a step back. But he covered it with a sneer, spitting into the dirt. "You'll regret this, Mitchell. My kin won't let it stand." Then he melted into the night, boots dragging, curses spilling behind him like oil. Elijah watched until the darkness swallowed him whole. Only then did he turn back toward the house. Lila stood in the doorway, shawl pulled tight, eyes wide in the lamplight. She said nothing, but the fear in her gaze told him she had heard enough. He lifted his hat in a gesture more solemn than polite and walked past her into the kitchen. The scent of stew still lingered, heavy with herbs, though the meal had grown cold. The silence pressed close. June had fallen asleep at the table, head nestled against her arm. Elijah lifted her gently, the small weight of her body cradled against his chest, and carried her to her bed. Lila followed, hands trembling at her apron strings. When he returned to the main room, Lila finally spoke. "He won't stop." Her voice broke on the words, but her eyes were steady now, dark with a kind of tired courage. "He'll keep coming until he breaks us." Elijah rested his hands on the table, the rough wood biting into his palms. He thought of the whispers in town, of Jonas Vale's warning, of Michael's kin waiting in shadows. He thought of the bruise on her wrist, of the fear in June's eyes. "I won't let him," he said. His voice was low, but it filled the room like thunder rumbling far off. For the first time, Lila's gaze softened, the lines of fear bending into something else, something fragile, almost like trust. The days that followed carried tension like a wire stretched too tight. Elijah worked the fields, his broad frame bent against the plow, but his eyes never strayed far from the fence-line. He knew Michael would not come alone. Men like him never did. The town felt it too. Whispers grew sharper, tongues quick to cut. At the mercantile, Lila endured stares that seemed to peel her skin. At church, pews shifted away when she entered. Only Mary Whitlow offered a steady hand, squeezing her fingers with quiet strength. It was in that churchyard, beneath apple blossoms falling like pale snow, that Elijah made his decision known. He walked beside Lila and June, his hand steady on the child's shoulder. The congregation watched, their whispers louder than hymns. And when Michael's cousin muttered something cruel beneath his breath, Elijah turned his gaze upon him, silent, unflinching. The man faltered, words dying in his throat. The blacksmith Jonas crossed himself. He knew then, as did all the town, that Elijah Mitchell had drawn a line. That evening, as lanterns flickered in the ranch windows, Lila set a trembling hand on Elijah's arm. It was a small thing, a gesture fleeting as a spring breeze, but it carried the weight of every unsaid word between them. "Why?" she whispered, eyes downcast. He looked at her for a long moment, the quiet stretching. Then he said simply, "Because no one stood for mine." She understood. Tears filled her eyes, not of weakness but of recognition, of seeing the boy he once had been, alone in silence. For the first time, her heart eased, just enough to let hope in Indiana. But hope is fragile, and Michael was not a man to let it grow. At the saloon, he nursed his bruised pride with whiskey, boasting of vengeance, promising blood. His kin cheered him on, slapping his back, sharpening the edges of his hate. The whole town felt the storm brewing, holding its breath against the thunder to come. Elijah knew it too. Each night, he walked the fence-line, lantern swinging, eyes scanning shadows. He knew he could not wait forever. A man could not live his life watching the horizon, fearing what might step from it. And so, one evening, with the sun bleeding red across the meadow, Elijah saddled his horse. He rode into town slow, deliberate, each hoofbeat like a drum announcing his intent. He tied his reins outside the saloon and stepped through the doors. The room hushed. Michael sat at the center table, cards in hand, whiskey dripping from the rim of his glass. His kin flanked him, rough men with hard eyes. The piano stilled, the dice fell quiet. All eyes turned to the rancher who had finally spoken with his silence. Elijah's voice cut through the hush, low and steady. "You'll leave her be, or you'll answer to me." Michael laughed, loud and ugly, but the laughter did not fill the room as it once had. Men shifted, uneasy. Jonas Vale, standing near the bar, held his hammer as though weighing what side of history he wanted to stand on. For a heartbeat, the saloon felt like a church, everyone waiting for judgment to fall. Elijah did not flinch. His eyes never left Michael's. He did not raise his fists, but the weight of his stance, the set of his jaw, the thunder in his stillness, all of it spoke louder than violence. Michael sneered, spitting into the sawdust. "You'll regret this, Mitchell." Elijah turned, leaving the saloon in silence thick as smoke. Outside, the night smelled of rain, heavy with promise. From a window above, Lila watched. Her breath caught when she saw him step into the street, his shoulders squared, his stride steady. For the first time since she had left Michael's house, she felt the faintest stir of safety. But in the saloon behind him, Michael's grin twisted, his words dripping like venom. "Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow he'll learn what it means to stand against me." The town's whispers carried through the night, faster than the wind, curling into every corner, every bed, every dream. And in the Mitchell ranch, as June slept sound in her bed, Lila sat awake by the window, shawl pulled tight. She saw the lantern still burning by the barn, Elijah's shadow moving against the dark. She pressed her hand against the glass, as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. She did not know if tomorrow would bring blood or freedom. But she knew this. A man had decided. And once a man like Elijah Mitchell decided, nothing on earth could turn him back. The storm gathered before dawn, thick clouds piling across the horizon like bruises spreading across the sky. The air carried the weight of something waiting, the cottonwoods along the creek bending and whispering in voices that spoke of reckoning. Elijah Mitchell stood on his porch with his hat low, watching the edge of the meadow where the mist pooled. His hands were steady, but his chest was heavy, for he knew the day would not pass without blood. Inside the house, the kitchen smelled faintly of last night's bread, though no one had eaten much. Lila Mae Carter moved with quiet care, braiding June's hair, tucking the child's shawl about her shoulders. June's eyes searched her mother's face, questions she was too young to speak rising like shadows in them. Lila kissed her brow, but the tremor in her lips betrayed the storm she felt inside. Elijah watched from the doorway, his broad frame filling it, and when Lila lifted her gaze she found him steady, offering nothing more than the silence that had begun to feel like promise. The town awoke slow, lanterns still burning in windows, the mud of Main Street carrying wagon ruts deep enough to hold the last rain. But whispers had traveled faster than the morning light. Men knew Michael had sworn vengeance, knew he and his kin would not let the insult stand. Women drew their children close as if danger had already arrived. The blacksmith Jonas hammered with more force than needed, sparks flying like warnings across the ground. Mary Whitlow prayed loud enough for neighbors to hear. The town lived that morning with its shoulders hunched, every ear tilted toward the creek where men were said to gather. Elijah saddled his horse with care, each buckle cinched as though he were sealing a vow. Lila stood by, her hands twisting at her apron, her breath short. She did not speak until he lifted the reins. "You don't have to," she whispered, her voice frayed at the edges. He looked at her then, and the silence stretched long between them until he broke it with words that seemed carved from stone. "I do." Her eyes filled, but she nodded, pressing her shawl closer about her shoulders. June clung to her skirts, watching him ride away, and for a moment the child's cry rose thin against the morning wind. Elijah did not look back. The path to the creek was lined with budding willows, their branches trembling. The water itself rushed swollen from spring rains, brown and restless, churning against the banks. There they waited, Harlan Michael at the center, his grin sharp, his kin gathered like wolves at his shoulders. Their boots were planted wide, their hands restless at belts and bottles. Elijah dismounted, every motion deliberate, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The silence held only the rush of water and the distant roll of thunder. Michael spat into the grass and stepped forward. "You've got nerve, Mitchell. Think yourself a hero, parading a ruined woman through town, standing in my way. But today we said it right." Elijah said nothing, only studied him with eyes that did not waver. That silence cut deeper than any retort, and it fanned Michael's fury. He lunged, fists raised, and the storm broke. The fight was not quick. It was a clash of bone and will, of years of cruelty meeting years of quiet restraint. Michael struck wild, fueled by whiskey and hate, while Elijah's fists landed like the swing of hammers, measured, deliberate. Each blow carried not only his strength but the memory of his mother's bruises, the sight of Lila's hidden pain, the sound of June's laughter trembling under fear. The men circled, mud flying, shouts rising from Michael's kin as they urged him on. One tried to step forward, but Jonas Vale appeared at the edge of the crowd, hammer in hand, voice sharp. This is between them. Others muttered, shifted, but none crossed. The town had begun to gather too, drawn by rumor and thunder. Men and women lined the far bank, their faces pale, their whispers carried off by wind. At last Michael faltered, blood running from his lip, his swing slow, his breath ragged. Elijah's fist caught him square, sending him sprawling into the mud. He tried to rise, but Elijah's boot pressed him down, not in cruelty but in finality. Elijah's voice rang across the water, low and steady. You'll not touch her again. Michael spat blood, curses tangled in his throat, but the fight was gone from his body. His kin shifted, eyes flicking between the rancher's broad stance and the watching town. One by one they turned away, leaving Michael in the mud. The storm above broke then, rain spilling sudden and heavy, washing blood into the earth. Elijah stood in it, chest heaving, rain sliding down his face like tears he would not shed. He turned toward the town, their eyes wide with awe and something like shame. For all their whispers, none had stood until this moment, none had chosen to shield what was fragile. Through the rain, he saw her. Lila stood on the far bank, shawl-soaked, hair clinging to her cheeks. June clutched her hand, eyes round. They had come, drawn by the noise, unable to stay behind. Elijah crossed the water slow, boots sinking, every step heavy with meaning. When he reached them, Lila lifted her face, tears mingling with rain. She searched him, trembling, and found not rage but steadiness, not pride but quiet strength. Her hand rose, hesitant, then rested against his chest. For the first time her voice carried no fear. You've given us more than safety. You've given us a home. Elijah covered her hand with his own, large and calloused, and the world seemed to still around them. The rain eased, the thunder rolled farther off, and the crowd began to drift, whispering no longer with malice but with wonder. Days later, under skies washed clean, the churchyard bloomed with apple blossoms. White petals fell like blessing upon the steps as Elijah Mitchell and Lila Mae Carter stood side by side. The preacher's voice was plain, the vows simple, but the weight of them filled every soul who gathered. June stood between them, her small hand wrapped in theirs, her smile bright as dawn. No grandeur marked the moment, only quiet dignity, as though heaven itself had chosen to clothe them in spring light. When Elijah lifted Lila's hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, the town exhaled as one. What had been scorn turned to respect, what had been whisper turned to memory. Afterward, as the sun dipped gold across the meadow, they returned to the ranch. The air smelled of damp earth and blossoms, the sky wide with promise. Elijah lifted June onto his shoulders, her laughter ringing free, while Lila walked at his side, her shawl trailing. For the first time in years her steps did not falter, for they fell in rhythm with his. That night, as the lamp burned low in the kitchen, Elijah sat with Lila on the porch. The crickets sang, the creek ran steady, and the bruises that had once told the story of her life had faded into nothing more than ghosts. She leaned against him, her head resting at his shoulder, and the silence they shared was no longer heavy but whole. The town would not forget. They would tell their children of the day Elijah Mitchell stood against Harlan Michael, of the rain that washed cruelty into the earth, of the marriage that grew not from passion's fire but from the slow, patient embers of safety and respect. And you, sitting here, listening to this old tale, remember this truth. Every bruise fades when touched by gentleness, every shadow lifts when one person chooses to stand. Before you go, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Every story belongs to someone listening, every heart carries its scars. Now, click on the story waiting on your screen. It will take you deeper still, and I'll be waiting there, like an old friend by the fire.